Thank you everyone for coming to a talk about standards at 4 p.m. So for context, I've been involved in the ZK proof standards for a few years now. And as with many standards efforts, the failure mode is that it tends to lose momentum because nobody's full-time job is standards. But recently, the EU Commission has been pushing for a digital identity wallet for rollout in 2026. And the solution that they chose was woefully inadequate for their own privacy regulations. And so essentially they're scrambling now for an actual zero-knowledge privacy-preserving solution. And they are considering generic ZK snarks, such as those that we work on. Now, the problem is that when you're engaging with actors at the level of nation states, they're going to ask you, like, what's the standard? And we don't have one. So that's the first motivation to work on a standard for generic ZK snarks, is to even make adoption possible at these scales. So you may have seen the announcement from the Google team that they'll be deploying a GKR Ligero snark in the Google Wallet. And they are targeting the EU Digital Identity Wallet use case as well. So yeah, if you were looking for the deployment of ZK snarks at scale, it is happening now. And we need the standard to match. We need a standard also to put in safeguards so that instantiations of these protocols are secure. So, for example, yeah, there's been any number of insecure Fiat Shamir instantiations. There was one very recently with Solana, I think. And then, yeah, like there's certain arguments that you need to be careful about what field you choose. And so basically, it's kind of like specifying a cipher suite. You need to specify what combinations of primitives within the cipher suite are secure. And lastly, a standard is important for upgradability. So this is the Google published an IETF informational draft. They called it libzk. It is not as generic as it sounds. libzk is just describing their specific GKR plus Ligero scheme. But yeah, even today we saw like Ligerito came out and it shrinks the Ligero proof size for very little overhead. And this field is developing very fast. It is too early to enshrine, to ossify a specific instantiation. So, and furthermore, in different deployment contexts, we need different parameters. We can relax security requirements in certain contexts. We can have bigger proofs in certain contexts, and so on. So yeah, standards at a sufficiently high level allow for this upgradability. Also, I invite any questions and comments at any point in this talk. Yeah, this is another example of a much older standard for a much simpler protocol, BBS signature, that allows for blind signatures, it allows for selective disclosure, it allows pretty much for the instantiation of anonymous credentials. It's way easier than, way simpler than generic ZK snarks, and a standard for it exists as well. But maybe worth noting that it relies on pairings, and there's also no standard for pairing-friendly curves. And also, there's no support for pairing-friendly curves in most secure hardware, in secure hardware elements. So that's why the EUDI wallet is looking for another solution, a generic ZK solution, like what Google has. So, yeah, I guess this talk really is putting forth a different vision for the standards process. So instead of standardizing each instantiation of a protocol, we should aim for a higher level of abstraction. And this is something like what Anya Lehman said in her real world talk, that basically the current standards process is duplicating a lot of work, and it's ending up with multiple inconsistent standards for the same primitive. Whereas how we could approach it is to rigorously standardize some core primitive, and then for subsequent application-specific variants, have a standards light process for that. So this is very much a balancing act because, as she mentions here, if your standard is too specific, no one else, it will not be useful for anyone else. If it's too powerful and too general, it will give no information. Yeah. So, and especially, I think all of us are familiar here with the modular structure of modern proof systems. That, for example, you can swap out a PCS, depending on if you're optimizing for a fast prover, if you're optimizing for a small proof, and so on. So it would be really painful if every time you had to swap out a component, you had to go through the whole standardization process again. So that's the intuition behind this meta standard approach, is that we do not, so like lots of us like mix and match multiple elements here in multiple stacks, and we do not want the situation where each combination has to map to a new standard. Yeah. Are there any questions? Okay. I think the standards world, we haven't been engaging with it that much, but the time is now, basically. So I do think the standards effort is closely related to the benchmarking effort, because benchmarking very much involves trying to find common points of comparison across different protocols. And you need to do it in a granular enough way that no one complains it's unfair. Yeah, but so I'm now gonna go through some existing efforts that are already ongoing to standardize generic ZK snarks. So the ZK proof standards has been working on standardizing the Planckish arithmetization for a few years now. So this is very much a specific arithmetization, and I think it's I think the arithmetization layer is probably the trickiest to standardize because, for instance, GKR just looks completely different from Planckish and R1CS. Air, for example, must be completely structured, cannot have pre-processing, cannot have randomness from the verifier, and so on. So I think, part of this talk is also sort of a call to action for people who are knowledgeable about, let's say, intermediate representations like ACIR, or like PIL, the polynomial identity language, or symbolic representations, to suggest just suitable levels of abstraction that we can target with our standards. So at the IOP level, this is an example of a protocol that sort of composes IOPs in parallel and in series and reduces them to a zero check. Many of our protocols do look like this. And so, yeah, a standard for IOPs should be flexible enough to allow composition like this. And I think here it's very related to formal verification efforts. So if you express your relation as a series of reductions, this is very natural for like Lean, for example, to understand. And I think this is very close to what we actually want for an IOP standard. So this is actually called interactive oracle reductions. So the next layer is polynomial commitment schemes. I think this is one of the most natural layers to standardize because PCS interfaces have arisen in many projects, such as artworks. I think this is the component that people most commonly swap out. And the PCS interface is relatively simple, just 4 methods. But of course, the devil is in the detail as well. Like maybe one thing you notice is artworks, it does not allow you to use a different field for your witness and your challenge, because I don't think they support small field PCSs. So there's subtleties like that arise. Maybe like your PCS needs more parameters, more degrees of freedom. And so, yeah, very much. So I'm working on a draft specification of PCSs. I presented this to the W3C for initial feedback. And this is part of my call to action for comments from you guys about what has been left out of the spec, whether or not it's useful, whether it sufficiently describes your protocol. Yeah. I'll put links and whatever. And the last step, so now we're at an interactive argument with polynomial commitments. And the last step is the Fiat-Shamir heuristic. So again, McKelly from the ZK Proof Standards Working Group has been pushing for an IETF draft for Fiat-Shamir, and also this library Spongefish for Fiat-Shamir with a duplex sponge. And I think this is very crucial to standardize just because of like frozen heart vulnerabilities, all the common insecure instantiations of Fiat-Shamir that we do see in the wild. So at the Ethereum Foundation's ZK project, we've been engaging with the Open EU Digital Identity Wallet discussions. We've also been engaging with standards bodies. So yeah, we've attended a bunch of the working group calls and have been familiarizing with ourselves with their existing specs. So they have this spec called data integrity that seems very much compatible with the spirit of using generic ZK snarks as sort of a layer for integrity assurance. So the idea here is if you replace base proof with, say, an ECDSA signature, the idea here is that you can verify that ECDSA signature within your ZK snark and present a derived proof to the verifier. So I think how they're using this right now is in the context of BBS proofs, whereby the base proof is a BBS signature and the derived proof is a BBS proof that selectively discloses a few of the messages. But yeah, this is very much the meta spec structure I was talking about, because they do have a generic VC data integrity, verifiable credential data integrity spec, and then allow for separate sort of standards light instantiations using different cipher suites. So I think there is precedence for this. So this is at the W3C, but I believe the IETF is not too fond of meta standards. But in any case, it's essential that we have reference implementations, benchmarks, and test vectors. This is just an example of how we've been trying to engage with existing standards outside the blockchain world. I think I'm gonna end with my call to action. So, yeah, I've been mostly engaging with people outside the ZK world. So people who are very much looking for like an approachable interface for developers who are unfamiliar with cryptographic primitives. So this crowd today is very different from that. You are experts in these cryptographic primitives. And what would be really helpful for us is if you could comment on our drafts. So success for us looks like a standard that is adopted. And we are aware that if people need to modify their libraries to fit the standard, then it's not going to happen. So if our standard does not sort of allow you to specify your library, your optimizations, the degrees of freedom that you need, it would help us a lot to know about this early. And yeah, I invite you to try your hand at writing a few standards light application-specific variants of the meta standard. So yeah, I think KZG would be the easiest by far. Ligero is used everywhere now. Google uses Ligero. Ligero is and Ligatron also uses Ligero. So that's a really good one to standardize as well. I think Google also did a lot of the work already in their libzk spec. So yeah, like submitting sort of standards light drafts. And then, as I mentioned, to just call to our attention, protocols and instantiations that you know of that don't fit into the standard. So like counterexamples, edge cases, and like requirements that you have that we don't meet. Yeah, that's all I had. Thank you.
So it seems that we need actually like either universal setup or like just no trusted setup, right? Is there actually a need for something like Groth16 to be standardized? Because like we have maybe 2 or 3 implementations of that, and it's much more widely deployed still in current systems.
Yeah, I wrote this to be general over trusted setups and transparent setups. I think the Groth16 is an interesting one that you bring up. Groth16 does not fit into this neat modularized sort of view of the modern snark. So yeah, it doesn't use an IOP, for example. So yeah, Groth16 is definitely a tricky one, and it's so wide. Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that. That's one of the main edge cases.
But would you say that's it'd be useful to standardize it? Because it does have a per circuit trusted setup. Like I'm just wondering what they actually cover use cases, and because that will be an easier point to attack, right? Because they're already widely deployed, and and want to have implementations, right? That maybe they can be more unified. But I'm curious if doing so will be useful. Because
okay, yeah, would like a standalone spec just for Groth16 be useful?
Yeah.
I think absolutely. As you said, the trusted setup and also like pairings. Yeah, if we had look, there was a standard for pairing friendly curves, and it expired like 2 years ago or something. We have a problem with momentum and losing it in the standards working groups. So yeah, I think standardizing Groth16 would be greatly helpful. Yeah.
Thanks.
So this question is like kind of tangential. So I was curious, like, if you feel like any like ZK DSLs, like NOR or ArcWorks, R1CS should be, or Circom should be, like standardized. And like, what do you think of those? Like personally, your opinion, like of these DSLs, which ones should be standardized for like common developers to use?
A really good question. Yeah. So I think arithmetization is the trickiest part to standardize just because of how much variance there is and how sort of mutually incompatible they seem. Like on the high level, you could say something general about all arithmetizations. You could say like they all need to take in some relation and witness, and they all need to output some zero check. But that's to me that's an example of like being too high level to be useful. So yeah, so there is a working group or that has been standardizing Plonkish for a few years now, and then yeah, I think another thought I had was to standardize it at the intermediate representation level. So for example, ACIR used by NOR, it can compile to both Plonkish and R1CS, for example, but not AIR. And there's like, there's many sort of attempts to generalize, like this CCS. What does it mean? Customizable constraint system, I think, also generalizes over Plonkish and R1CS. Yeah, so I don't know. Arithmetizations is, I think, the trickiest. Yeah, my best sort of approach would be to target the one level lower, like at the intermediate representation. Yeah. Thank you.